Welcome to the channel where powerful stories come to life. Get ready for truth, emotion, and transformation, one story at a time. There are things we only believe when we see them, and others we only believe when we live them. Aline, a black woman in modest clothing, arrived at the first-class boarding gate with a legitimate ticket, but was blocked as if she were an intruder. The reason? Her appearance. The result? One of the most powerful lessons in corporate empathy and leadership in recent times. Because what no one knew there, and maybe you didn't either, is that she was the majority shareholder of the airline. This story became a case study in universities, went viral on social media, and shook the foundations of the business world. But more than just causing a stir, it sparked real transformation, and you're about to understand why. Get ready for a narrative that will challenge your beliefs, touch invisible wounds, and show you, once and for all, that respect isn't measured by clothing, but by humanity. There are moments when silence says it all. When Aline arrived at the boarding gate, no one had to yell for her to know she was being judged. The employee's gaze, the sharp tone of voice, and the automatic phrase, "This line is for VIP passengers only," carried years of prejudice packed into a single second. It's curious how some stories begin with a no disguised as politeness. It's not about the ticket, it's about the idea that some people don't belong in certain places. And that idea, unfortunately, is more common than it seems. Aline, with her modest clothing, natural hair, and calm posture, was pushed aside by an invisible label, premature judgment. And the worst part, many nearby saw it happen and stayed silent, the kind of silence that perpetuates inequality. When we don't react, we agree, and when we agree, we become accomplices. That's why some stories keep repeating, because no one dares to interrupt them while they're still being written. But Aline, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't cause a scene. She did something far more powerful. She observed, as if she already knew that this was only the first scene of a monumental turning point. And that's where many people get it wrong, thinking that responding has to be loud. But sometimes the most strategic move is the calmest one. And curiously, it's in that silence where the deepest stories are born. Most people in that airport lounge knew the name of the airline, but none of them knew the name behind the silent transformation the company was undergoing. Aline, who had been barred for looking out of place, was actually the one funding the very space where they tried to silence her. And the most ironic part? Her path to that moment was made of stories that could never fit on a name badge or a boarding pass. Before becoming the majority shareholder, Aline was a math teacher in public schools in underserved areas. She created simple, revolutionary teaching methods that became a reference. And over time, that led to the creation of an accessible education startup. She wasn't born wealthy. She didn't inherit a fortune. She built it, brick by brick, dream by dream. And when she sold her company for billions, she reinvested in ventures that could change more lives, including the airline itself. It's curious how some stories only make sense in hindsight. That employee's prejudice, for example, wasn't just ignorance. It was a snapshot of an entire system that still confuses appearance with significance. But Aline understood the weight of a name, and she knew the best answer wasn't in arguing at the airplane door, but in what would come next. Some react with anger, others with shouting. Some explode, others shut down. But Aline? She responded with something few expect when faced with prejudice: strategic intelligence. The moment she was blocked, not by mistake but by judgment, she didn't argue. Didn't yell, didn't lose composure. She simply took a deep breath and let the scene unfold. Because those who know their own worth don't rush to prove it. They observe, and they transform. She had nothing to prove there, at that boarding gate with strangers' eyes labeling her out of place. Because people who know their own story understand that others' prejudice says more about them than about you. Instead of making a scene, she did something even more powerful. She documented. Every face, every gesture, every careless word. It wasn't about revenge. It was about delivering a lesson, with the same intention you plant a seed. And the patience of someone who knows some stories only bloom with time. That night at home, Aline didn't cry. She didn't despair. She knew she wasn't the only one who had gone through that, and unfortunately, wouldn't be the last. But she decided hers would be different. That moment wouldn't be just another scene in a sea of ignored stories. It would be a turning point. A wake-up call, an example. And for that, she needed to think like someone who understands the system, but refuses to repeat it. The next day, she returned, not with resentment, but with composure, not as a passenger, but as a leader. The same woman who had been blocked due to her appearance now walked confidently toward the executive boardroom. It was an emergency meeting, and no one knew the exact reason, until she entered. Silence, curious glances, some nervous, others pretending nothing happened, but Aline was calm. Because when someone understands the game of power, they know that victory doesn't always happen on the same field where they were attacked. The most effective response comes when no one expects it, and in a place where no one can ignore it. She stood up, with elegance and firmness, and began to speak. No notes, no slides, just her presence said it all. She described what had happened, in detail, but not as a victim, as an analyst. She showed how the incident wasn't isolated, but a reflection of an invisible structure that still decides a person's worth based on clothing, skin color, or appearance. And she made it clear, what's at stake isn't the comfort of a few, but the integrity of everyone. That room suddenly felt small in the face of what she laid bare. It wasn't a complaint. It was a mirror, and many there didn't like what they saw, but it was necessary, because some transformations only happen when someone dares to reveal the flaws without fear of being discredited. And Aline knew that. She knew silence only fuels the cycle, and that her words, in that moment, could disrupt the pattern, open space for other stories, fairer, more human ones. She didn't ask for firings. She didn't demand punishments. She called for awareness, because real change starts when culture shifts, not when a scapegoat is chosen. And she proposed real training, immersive experiences, active listening, protocol reviews, and the creation of an inclusion committee with real power and voice. And most importantly, that real stories be included in the company manuals so that no one would be made invisible again. And so, with an 18-minute speech and not a single tear, Aline planted the seed of a revolution, one that didn't come from outrage, but from a decision, from a steady gaze that didn't drop, from a discomfort that turned into movement. Because when someone like her occupies positions of power, stories change tone. What was once normalized becomes questioned. What was once acceptable becomes unacceptable. Days later, what began at a boarding gate turned into a series of internal initiatives. The company launched the Recognize program, gathering real cases of discrimination experienced by employees and customers. The goal wasn't to expose, but to enlighten, to bring to light what had long been swept under the rug, to build bridges, not walls, to develop more conscious leadership, and above all, to ensure that no story like Aline's would need to repeat in order to be heard. And the most powerful part? The response from people. Employees who thanked her for saying what many felt but were afraid to voice. Customers who regained trust in the brand. Executives who in silence began rethinking their own behavior. Because her words weren't an accusation, they were an invitation to a new way of coexisting, of respecting, of existing. Today, what happened at that airport isn't remembered as a scandal, but as a landmark, a turning point. One of those stories that begin in pain but end in strength. Aline became a symbol not of suffering, but of conscious leadership. And her attitude inspires other women, other Black people, other professionals not to stay silent. To believe that yes, the game can be changed. With strategy, not rage. With structure, not scandal. Because in the end, the difference between revenge and justice lies in the impact it leaves behind. And Aline's impact was so profound it didn't stay within the company. It became a reference in seminars, a case study in training programs, a topic in universities, all without her ever once raising her voice. She wasn't looking for applause. She was building transformation, and she succeeded. So the next time you witness prejudice or are a target of it, remember Aline, her calm strength, her quiet courage, and the way she used her story not to get even, but to plant something greater. Because stories like this aren't just meant to be heard. They're meant to be continued, and who knows, maybe the next one will be yours. It was supposed to be just another routine meeting, but the expressions around the table changed the moment Aline walked in. Some didn't even know who she was. Others pretended to be surprised. But all it took was for her to request access to the security footage for the entire atmosphere to shift. Without raising her voice or dramatizing, she dropped a surgical phrase. "I'd like everyone to watch this with me." On the screen, the exact replay of the discrimination she had endured, captured in real time by cameras that don't lie. As the footage played, the silence in the boardroom spoke louder than any excuse. Aline didn't need to say much. The video spoke for itself. The staff member, the approach, the rejection, the diverted glances. Everything was there, recorded. When the footage ended, Aline simply looked around and asked a question that still echoes in many companies. Is this the kind of service that represents our airline? No accusations, no public shaming, just a mirror, revealing a truth no one wanted to see. And that's the power of someone who masters stories. It's not about winning through force, but through coherence. Aline didn't want to point fingers. She wanted to point directions. Because she knew, changing a system starts with courage, but is only sustained by structure. And that was exactly what she was about to begin building, right there at that table. Because what came next wasn't just a response to a mistake. It was a plan for transformation and for takeoff. One director, visibly uncomfortable, tried to downplay the situation with the same tired excuse. It was just a misunderstanding. We have such a busy routine. But before he could finish, Aline interrupted with the calmness of someone who's heard too many excuses. It wasn't a mistake. It was judgment. And that needs to change. The phrase hit like a silent lightning bolt, because deep down, everyone knew she was right. That's the mark of true leadership, turning discomfort into reflection. She proposed something few leaders would dare, an internal re-education program. It wasn't about punishment. It was about transforming the culture, and that would take more than conduct manuals or nice quotes in training sessions. Aline wanted to reach the sore spots to provoke in the places no one wanted to touch, because stories like hers aren't exceptions. They're symptoms of an entire system that needs to relearn how to truly see, and that only happens with deep, structural change. The program would be bold. It wouldn't be limited to customer service roles. It would involve everyone, from the shop floor to the executive suite, psychologists, diversity consultants, people with lived experiences. No one would leave unchanged, and that was precisely the point. Because empathy only builds when you're allowed to feel someone else's discomfort. And while some were still digesting the proposal, Aline was already drafting the next step, with a name, structure, and direction. The project got its name even before it was formalized. First-class respect, a play on words that united what the company lacked. Respect, with where prejudice often hides. First class. Aline knew that real change needs powerful names that generate identification and spark reflection. More than that, she knew that learning only sticks when it stops being theory and becomes lived experience. So no more empty lectures. The new plan was about feeling it on the skin. The training would be immersive, with exercises, dialogue circles, and even simulations with undercover actors. The idea was for employees to make mistakes in a safe environment, so they wouldn't repeat them with real passengers. Anyone who's been through this kind of experience knows the impact. When you hear someone tell a story of discrimination at the bank, the supermarket, or the hospital, you don't forget. You change. And the most surprising part was how far the proposal reached. The plan, initially designed for the ground and flight crews, ended up extending to administrative teams, executives, and even shareholders. Because Aline wanted more than an operational adjustment, she wanted an internal revolution. A new corporate culture where respect was the #1 value. And while the first training sessions were being prepared, one person in particular was invited to the first group. The employee who had blocked Aline at the gate was there, sitting in the room among the first guests of the program. She hesitated, was skeptical, almost refused. But something inside her, maybe curiosity, maybe shame, made her accept. At first, she was silent, withdrawn. But after hearing the first stories, something began to shift. Black women sharing about diverted glances, closed doors, denied opportunities. Suddenly, everything that had seemed like exaggeration became palpable reality before her eyes. She was moved. She cried genuinely upon realizing that what she had done to Aline wasn't an isolated case. It was a pattern. And the hardest part? She was part of that pattern. But in that safe listening space, free from judgment, she began to see what she had previously ignored. The transformation began from the inside out, as it should, and that wasn't a miracle. It was the result of an environment built with wisdom and intention, a space where mistakes became bridges, not walls. And the most powerful part? She herself asked to speak at the end of the day. She said she would never treat a passenger the way she treated Aline again, not out of obligation, but out of awareness. She said she wanted to help with the program, to share her own story as a warning to colleagues. And at that moment, Aline's idea proved to be even greater than planned, because the impact wasn't just immediate. It was human, it was real, and it opened space for something even more powerful to come. Days later, the company's main auditorium was packed, every seat taken, people from all departments, from operations to strategy, from janitors to board members. The atmosphere was tense with curiosity. No one knew exactly what to expect from that last-minute meeting, but one thing was certain. Everyone wanted to hear Aline, the woman who, until recently, had been invisible to many, and now was the name whispered in every hallway. When she stepped onto the stage, there was no fanfare, no background music, no dramatic spotlights, just a microphone, a soft spotlight, and the immense presence of someone who carries deep truths. Aline stood at the center of the stage with the same poise with which, days earlier, she had stood firm in the boarding line. She took a deep breath, looked everyone in the eye, and with the calm of someone who has weathered storms, she said, "I'm not here to punish, I'm here to transform." The silence was absolute. It was as if that sentence had suspended time. It wasn't a motivational talk. It wasn't a scripted speech. It was a call, a manifesto. Every word seemed to peel away layers of insensitivity that had built up over years of automatic interactions and snap judgments. She began by telling her story, not as a martyr, nor as a heroine, but as a real person, someone who wakes up early, takes the subway, endures sidelong glances, and learns to smile through wounds. She said she never expected recognition, but always hoped for respect. And what hurt that day wasn't a staff member's mistake. It was the echo of a culture that still insists on tying value to appearance. She shared how she was stopped, even with the ticket in hand, how she was treated like an imposter, like someone out of place. She described the side glances, the impatient tone, the way they tried to correct her presence with politeness disguised as disdain. And she shared how it felt, a mix of pain, humiliation, and helplessness. The hollow realization that, even with every right to be there, she still had to prove she deserved it. But the most powerful part came after, when she explained how she chose to respond, not with anger, not with outrage, but with strategy, with structure, with the poise of someone who understands that justice isn't about revenge, it's about change, and that sometimes real power lies in not repeating the other person's mistake. The difference between revenge and justice is in the impact you leave behind. The phrase echoed through the room. Executives exchanged glances. Some employees quietly wiped away tears. It was impossible not to see oneself in some way, in all of it, because everyone there had either judged or been judged. Everyone had laughed at someone behind their back. Everyone in some way had been either an accomplice or a victim in a system that normalizes exclusion. That's when Aline shifted the tone of her speech. She didn't dwell on the past. She projected the future. She spoke about what the company could become, about the listening spaces that could be created, about the kind of training that needed to go beyond numbers and reach the stories. And with calm yet unwavering conviction, she declared, "Prejudice isn't just an individual problem. It's a collective failure, and as long as we pretend it's an exception, it will keep being the rule." She pointed out paths, proposed solutions, invited everyone in the room to become agents of change. She said real transformation doesn't begin with slogans on the wall, but with conversations by the coffee machine. It doesn't begin in campaigns. It begins in everyday actions, and that any company that wants to fly high must first look at those who've never been seen. She ended with the phrase that in that moment became a symbol of a new era. Our company only deserves to soar if it learns to see those on the ground. There was a pause, a heavy silence filled with reflection, and then the applause began. Not the kind that's rehearsed, but a genuine surge of emotion. People stood up. People cried. People were moved. Because that speech wasn't just about Aline. It was about all of us. About the stories ignored in the hallways. About the merit drowned out by arrogance. About the talent silenced by prejudice. She stepped down from the stage without theatrics, without chasing the spotlight, but she left behind a trail of awareness. In the days that followed, her words became a company slogan. Leadership began reviewing procedures. Active listening groups were created. Diversity protocols were updated. But above all, there was a shift in perspective. And like every great leader, Aline knew, a single speech doesn't change everything, but it can be the spark that ignites transformation, a spark that travels beyond boardrooms and across borders, because when a silenced voice is finally heard, it doesn't speak only for itself. It speaks for an invisible crowd that's long been waiting for a place to belong. And that's how, without yelling, without attacking, without bowing to prejudice, Aline touched hearts, redefined direction, and taught through her words and presence that some stories are born from pain, but they blossom in the courage of those who refuse to be silenced. The impact came like a storm, but this time, it was a cleansing one, not a destructive one. The video of Aline's speech spread across the globe. Universities began citing the case in courses on corporate diversity. International companies reached out to learn about the First Class of Respect program. And most astonishing of all, passengers from around the world began sharing similar stories on social media. It was as if what happened to Aline had flipped on a light switch people didn't know was off. Suddenly, the airline once accused of institutional racism became a global benchmark in organizational re-education, not because it had always gotten things right, but because it had the courage to acknowledge its mistakes and turn them into concrete action. And that's what many companies still don't get. The world doesn't demand perfection. It demands humanity. It demands responsibility in the face of failure and empathy in the face of pain. But perhaps the greatest legacy was this: creating space for other stories to be heard. Because when a black woman, a former teacher, becomes the majority shareholder and decides to teach through action what others only preach, she doesn't just change a company, she changes the landscape. And in that new landscape, a new protocol began to form, one that made it clear: respect from now on would no longer be tied to uniforms, badges, or appearances. It would be the rule, for everyone. Shortly after, a new internal policy was announced, as direct as it was transformative. Every employee was to treat every passenger as if they could be a shareholder, a partner, or an investor, not because they were, but because respect should never be conditional on status or looks. From that point forward, being kind, welcoming, and professional would no longer be optional. It would be the standard. As simple as that. Because great stories aren't built with gold-plated name tags, but with consistent character. Aline made a point of closely overseeing the implementation of that new directive. She visited departments, listened to stories, asked for names, not as an inspector, but as a mentor. She wanted to ensure that what was written in the policy lived in daily behavior. After all, every manual looks good on paper. What matters is practice. And here's the most beautiful part. Spontaneous stories began to emerge of employees changing their behavior. People started seeing others before making assumptions. The message was clear. Respect isn't something you wear. It's something you practice, something you feel, something that transforms. And when an entire culture begins to shift around that principle, everything changes. Customer service improves. The work environment evolves. And the stories, oh, those stories that were once filled with pain, become stories of inspiration. Because a company can only truly soar when it carries the most human part of itself, even at high altitudes. And now tell me honestly, how many times have you walked past someone, on the street, at work, in a waiting room, and judged them without even realizing? Judged them by their worn-out shoes, brandless clothes, natural hair, reserved posture. How many chances have you missed to connect with deep, transformative, and courageous stories, just because you learned unconsciously to tie worth to appearance? The truth is harsh, but it needs to be said. We grow up hearing, "Don't judge a book by its cover," in a world that teaches us to do exactly that. And Aline's case lays this bare. A black woman modestly dressed, holding a legitimate first-class ticket, treated like she was trespassing into a place she didn't belong. But here's the most symbolic part. It wasn't the ticket that validated her. It was the turnaround. Aline didn't yell, didn't retaliate, didn't ask for help. She simply waited for the right moment to reveal who she was. And when the executive recognized the principal shareholder, right there in front of everyone, the room fell silent. Because some silences scream. They scream shame. They scream guilt. They scream the discomfort of realizing you were terribly wrong. And these stories, my friend, don't just happen in airports. They happen every day, everywhere. At schools, when a quiet student is overlooked. In supermarkets, when the cashier treats customers differently based on their shoes. In HR, when a brilliant resume is dismissed because of the photo. Or even on social media, when people are judged by their follower count, likes, or aesthetic. These are automatic judgments, so deeply rooted they don't even feel like prejudice. But they are, and each one chips away at our shared humanity. And here comes the question that should keep echoing. What would you do if you were the employee? And more importantly, what would you do if you were Aline? Because being met with suspicion, even after doing everything right, isn't just embarrassing. It's a cruel reminder that to many people you'll never be enough unless you prove it, unless you show the badge, the title, the last name, the bank account. But why should it be this way? Why does respect still depend on validation? Why do we only recognize worth when there's a title attached? These are the questions stories like Aline's force us to ask, not to shame, but to change, to re-educate our lens, to stop living on autopilot and start acting with awareness. Because it's not enough to learn the lesson, we have to apply it. That's where transformation begins, when we choose to do things differently. And doing things differently might be simpler than it seems. It starts with a genuine good morning, without looking down on anyone, with a sincere compliment to someone who's often invisible, with the effort to listen to those you assume have nothing to say, because every person carries an entire universe within them, stories of struggle, pain, perseverance, affection, resilience. And when you ignore that, you lose more than you realize. You lose the chance to become better. And maybe you're thinking, but I'm not prejudiced. And that's fair. Good intentions matter. But you know what matters more than intention? Action. Because even the well-meaning make mistakes. Even the kind slip up. Even those who think they've already learned still need to unlearn. And that's why telling stories like this is so urgent. They're not just isolated events. They're mirrors. And sometimes the reflection stings. It hurts to realize you've made someone feel like they didn't belong, that you turned away, that you diminished someone with a glance. But that discomfort is necessary, because it creates space for real change. And that's when you must decide, will you keep watching other people's stories unfold, or will you become the protagonist of the change this world needs? And if you've made it this far, it's because something inside you has already begun to shift. So take a deep breath and ask yourself, what's the next step? Will you keep letting autopilot drive your decisions? Or will you make respect a conscious, daily, and non-negotiable choice? Will you keep repeating the same mistakes? Or use this reflection to start acting differently from now on? Because the truth is, the world doesn't change with pretty speeches. It changes with action, with small, consistent gestures, with people who choose every day to see others as equals. People who understand that every appearance hides a story, and that our role isn't to judge the cover, but to open the book and read with respect, curiosity, and empathy. Aline didn't need to prove anything. She already was everything, long before anyone recognized it. But sometimes life uses certain stories to teach collective lessons, and if this one touched you in any way, if it made you reconsider a behavior, share it. Send it to someone who needs to hear it. That coworker who keeps saying this is just victimhood. That relative who thinks respect is something you buy. That friend who needs to learn how to listen before pointing fingers. And of course, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and join us in building a world where respect is the boarding pass for everyone. A world where no one has to prove their worth to be treated with dignity. Where appearance doesn't determine access, and stories aren't ignored. They're celebrated. Because here we believe no story is too small to be heard, and none too simple to inspire. And if you have a story like this, or a completely different one with the same core message, share it in the comments. Your experience might open someone's eyes. It might comfort, awaken, or transform. Because at the end of the day, that's what we want, to change the world, one story at a time.